It's my pleasure to help kick off this conference for returning seasoned teachers, but also especially a welcome to the new incoming faculty to Seneca College. I think it's a great idea to have a two-day conference like this before the start of term. I wish my own university would do this. Because one of the things to keep in mind, I think, as a new faculty member is that you probably don't have any formal training as a post-secondary educator. And a conference like this, I think, really helps to get you to be at least aware of some of the issues and start a lifelong program of learning and improving your own teaching skills. So for me, I teach a large introductory psychology course at McMaster University. And for me, my favorite part of this is that I teach first-year students. So we have an interesting mix of different departments represented at each of these tables, I think. So I want you to take a minute right now to discuss at your tables what you think are some of the challenges and benefits of teaching first-year students who are just entering post-secondary education. So I'll give you guys a minute to discuss, and we'll take up some comments from this room. Okay, let's call time there. Started hearing some interesting discussions right at this table here. Mainly challenges, it sounded like. So this is, I think, a really good conversation for you to have throughout the next 2 days. We have more and more students that are coming to post-secondary education. Let's first hear about what do you think are some of the benefits of teaching students who are first coming into post-secondary education. What's the benefit of teaching them?
I would say that the brain development is they're at their most creative.
Okay.
So you're going to get very interested people that you could really help to develop that.
So you definitely come across some very motivated students who are very excited. They're excited about discovery, asking questions. What else? What are other benefits of teaching first-year students? Yeah.
I think you can start them on the right path in terms of proper habits to develop.
Yep.
When they're in this now more independent environment.
Okay, so they're at their kind of most moldable, you think, when they come into that first year. You could be the one that sets them off on the right path. Okay, that sounds good. Let's hear about a couple of the challenges of teaching first-year students. Yeah?
Many of them don't want to be there in the first place. Their parents sent them there.
This is just the next logical step for them to do. They're not necessarily as motivated as some of the students we want them to be. Okay, what else? Yeah?
We talked about probably the most obvious one is the use of smartphones.
Okay, so distractions, ongoing distractions in the classroom. Another thing that, there's a transition point. At first, many students start off asking lots of questions. They're really genuinely interested in discovery, and then they become obsessed with grades, right? So should I do this? Well, how much is it worth? If it's worth 0.5%, they might, I don't even know if it's quite worth my time and effort to do. So one of the first challenges I give to my students in first year, very first class, is to ask them to remember a time when they didn't even care about grades, where they really just cared about asking questions. They wanted to discover when they were like natural scientists. And I said, can you think of anyone like this? And I said, well, I live with one. So this is Monica. She's 6 years old. And she asks me many, many questions every single day. So on this day, she was just testing to see whether or not she could catch snowflakes on her eyelashes, and she was just testing out this idea. Another day, she asked me this classic question. Does the light in the fridge go out when you close the door? So rather than just kind of reflexively give her an answer, I asked her, I don't know, what do you think? And she said, well, maybe we could do an experiment to find out what happens. And I said, well, what should we do? And she said, well, how about we'll take everything out of the fridge, let's take out the shelves, I'll go inside the fridge, close the door, and then I'll tell you exactly what happened. I said, well, that sounds like a good idea, but I really like that you're thinking about this. And when I tell this story to my students, I say, think like a 6-year-old. Like, she's not caring about the grade here. She's really just caring about finding out the answer and being creative and really taking an active role here. I could just tell her the answer, but part of the joy of learning, I think, is even just the discovery. So, what are the problems that first-year students face? One of the big transitions, I think, is the sheer volume of information that they have to consume. Especially coming from high school, where they felt like things were just handed to them on a plate. When they get to university and college, there's a huge volume of information that they're expected, in some cases, just outright memorize, but also we want them to demonstrate mastery. And when you ask students themselves, what sort of study habits do you use to prepare for your upcoming tests? The most common answers are highlighting and rereading notes or textbook. Why? Because in the past, this was an effective practice for most of these students. So if you think about the students that go on to post-secondary education, they're the ones that probably did the best in high school. And for many high school curricula, simply highlighting and rereading notes, especially if you get tests where you simply have to recall or recognize information, this is actually a sufficient practice. And from what we'll call a metacognitive perspective, so judgments of your own learning, this makes sense as well. Unfortunately, when you look across many different studies, highlighting and simply rereading notes or textbook have very low utility for actually improved academic success. One reason is that it's very easy to slip into a passive form of learning instead of being actively engaged with the material. So let's think of a student who has a textbook in front of them. They're sitting down at a desk for maybe 2 hours, and at the end of that 2 hours, they've turned these red pages into yellow pages. Now, from a student's perspective, this feels good. I mean, no one can argue that physical labor has not taken place here. Like, you even have evidence here. And so a student that does this and kind of just passively engages in highlighting, they might even find that they can reread the same text faster and faster. So this creates what we call fluency. And the danger of fluency is that it's very easy to equate fluency with actual deep understanding of the material. So this is what psychologists would call a misattribution of fluency. And so when you feel that you can reread the same material faster and faster, you could convince yourself, well, I know this material. And if you don't do any practice retrieval testing, on the day of the test, if this is the very first time that you're actually even retrieving that information, it becomes a big surprise that you actually don't know the material. So I've met with many students during office hours during the first few weeks of the course where they show me that they've highlighted and they show me all their notes, and they've copied down verbatim the exact examples I've given. And one student might say, well, I do know what an independent variable is. And I'll ask them, well, what is it? And they'll give me the perfect textbook definition of what an independent variable is. But then I'll just ask them, well, what does that mean in your own words? And they'll say, what do you mean? And they'll just give back the exact textbook definition. And I'll say, well, then I'll show them the test question, and I'll say, it describes an experiment and says, pick out the independent variable and explain why that is the independent variable. They can't answer that question. And what that demonstrates is that, yeah, they can memorize a definition, but that is not the same thing as actually mastering that definition. So at a minimum, I tell them, you should be able to come up with your own examples to explain this concept to other people. Okay. It's not just students that have poor metacognitive judgments about learning, it's also teachers. How do you, as a faculty member, decide how you're going to teach a course? You're probably not going to go through all the research on pedagogy and scholarship of teaching and learning to guide every single decision that you make about teaching, so it's evidence-based. More likely than not, you're going to look back at your prior experience from other teachers and follow that example that was given to you. The problem is that there are many intuitions about effective teaching that highly influence educational practice that are simply wrong or lack any data to support them. I don't have time to go through this entire list, but I will pick on one. So there's something called learning styles. So how many people here are familiar with the term learning styles? When I ask my own class in first year, how many people here have taken a psychometric test to determine what type of learning style you are? About 3/4 of the students say yes. So there's audio, there's visual learners, there's kinesthetic learners. In fact, there's dozens upon dozens of learning styles that have been identified. And the strong version of this theory is that if we can do a psychometric test to evaluate what type of learning style you are, and we match the teaching style, that will lead to improved academic performance. It sounds like a good idea. The problem is there's no data to support this hypothesis. Nevertheless, it's a multi-million-dollar industry of psychometric testing, and it's so well ingrained in educational practice that people just assume, well, someone must have done a study that supports it. Unfortunately, there's no data that supports this. Well, what can we fall back on then for evidence-based practice? I'm a cognitive psychologist, so in a controlled lab setting, we study things like attention, memory, learning, mind wandering, executive control, working memory. And we think that some of the things that we've learned about how the mind works can be directly impacting to guide educational practice, instructional design. What we're most interested in is what I'm going to call durable learning. So there are certain tricks and tips that you can do to increase short-term learning, but for the most part, that's going to be quite useless. You really want to have learning that extends beyond this quiz, beyond the midterm, perhaps even beyond the final exam, especially if you're teaching a course where there are instructors at the next level who are depending on your course as a prerequisite. So students should carry this knowledge into that next course. Otherwise, you're going to have to start from scratch. Then we really are interested in this concept called durable learning. And I'm going to explore 3 factors that cognitive psychologists have been studying in both controlled lab and classroom intervention studies. The first is what is seemingly an obvious point, that learning begins with effortful and focused attention. And this is more difficult to implement than you can possibly imagine. Even in this lecture right now, at some point, your mind is going to start wandering. This is a natural feature of our minds. One of the goals, though, of some of these intervention studies is, can we tame some of that unintentional mind wandering so that students are actually focusing during the learning period? The goal is not to completely eliminate unintentional mind wandering from the mind period. It's a natural feature, but the goal is during this set learning period where we all agree to sit here together, if we can reduce some of that unintentional mind wandering, the assumption is that learning gains will be observed. Secondly, as the instructor for your students, you really are setting the stage for effective learning. And I'm going to be talking to you a bit about research in multimedia design principles and how making better PowerPoint presentations or whatever slideware that you use leads to what I think are the biggest gains in learning that you can directly see. And this is something that's 100% under your control. Third, as instructors, it really is up to us, as one of our participants said here, to set the stage, set the pathway for lifelong learning in our students. And we can do that by incorporating effective study habits and direct changes in your actual course curriculum to model these types of behaviors. And I'll give you several examples of how I do that. Okay, but let's begin with the first point here, that learning begins with effortful and focused attention. If you happen to not be a cognitive psychologist and you want to do a little bit of last-minute reading, here's a book that I recommend. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It summarizes a lifetime of research from one of the most famous cognitive psychologists. You'll learn a lot about how humans make decisions, how they make judgments, how they learn about the world. And in this book, Daniel Kahneman uses the metaphor of two systems of thinking that a person can bring to any situation. The first, system one, is a reflexive, involuntary, very quick judgment type of thinking. So this is when our prior experiences, our biases, and heuristics guide very quick snap type of judgments. And the second, system two, this is the slow, it's effortful, and it's a voluntary process. So you have to actively choose to engage in system two thinking. And for many of our decisions as we walk around the world, system one thinking is just fine. But when you're trying to engage in deep learning for durable learning that retains for the long term, it's much better if you can engage in this system two level of thinking. And so I encourage my students to really make an active choice to think deeply rather than just reflexively about information. And to test my students, I give them a very simple math problem on the very first day of class. And I tell them, there's no tricks to this math question, but you have to actually make a calculation. This is a grade school level calculation that you can make. So I will give you the exact same question. And I will warn you that when I give this question to my students, half the class gets this question wrong, even with this big, long buildup. Okay, so a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. Everyone with me? If you're with me, just raise your hand. Okay. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. Still with me? Pretty simple. How much does each item cost? Now, don't give in to system one thinking and just give a reflexive answer, which would be $1.10. But that would be a 90 cents difference, right? So who here is confident about the correct answer? What is the answer? 5 cents and $1.05. Could you kind of enlighten? There's a few people, I think, that didn't get that. How did you get that answer? Great.
So this is has offers the example of the relearning data system.
Okay.
You have two equations. X means the price of bat and Y represent the price of ball. So you write out X plus Y is 1.1, X minus Y is 1, you solve them.
Okay. Maybe even more simply, let's take $1 off the price, right? You're left with 10 cents. It should be equally divided between the bat and the ball, so you're left with 5 cents and $1 plus 5 cents. So $1.05 and 5 cents. Would everyone agree with that? Please raise your hand if you understand the explanation. Great. So I say the same thing to my students. I said, so if I gave you this question on the final exam, would you get it right? And everyone says, yeah, of course I would get it right. So not only are students expected to consume huge volumes of information, we expect them to retain that knowledge and then apply it in novel situations. So on the final exam, I'm not going to give them the exact same question. I'm going to test them on the same concept, but in a context they haven't seen before. So I will ask them, a BMW and Tesla cost $160,000. The BMW costs $100,000 more. How much does each car cost? Let's just shout out the answer with the lowest price first on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And? Okay, I didn't hear a complete uniform, but the answer is $30,000 and $130,000. So when I ask this question, only about 2/3 of the class gets it right. So 1/3 is still getting it right. So on the very first day, I'm showing them, look, you really have to pay attention. You really have to just not just memorize the concept, you have to actually understand it. Okay. Next, another part about attention, focusing attention, is that many people believe that they're very good at multitasking. Maybe there's some people here that also think that they're very good at multitasking. You're not. There are a very small elite group of people called supertaskers that apparently show very little decrement as you add tasks onto them. But for the most part, human beings are very poor at multitasking. We're far better off at single tasking because as you switch from one task to another in a multitasking environment, it divides your attention and there's a cost from switching from one task to another. And so I try to convince my students, we're only here together this morning for 50 minutes. Really actively choose to focus your attention here. Don't have Facebook open or any other type of social media. And I show them this study. It's not just you that has to buy into this. As a class, everyone has to buy into this. So here is a useful study done by one of my former grad students, Faria Sana. In this study, there was a lecture hall where everyone is about to listen to a lecture and they're told at the end of this lecture, there's going to be a test to see how well you understood the material that was presented. Sprinkled throughout the lecture are some Confederates in this study who are on the computer. For the most part, they are paying attention to the lecture, but occasionally they start multitasking. They open up an email program, they send a text message, they might pull up a video, some sort of multitasking event that has nothing to do with the lecture. The question was, how does this behavior of other people around you impact student learning? And so you can compare two groups of people. Students who had a view of a multitasking peer, so even though they are not multitasking, out of the corner of their eye, they can see occasionally that there's someone who's not 100% on task, and compare that to other students who did not have a view of someone who is multitasking. When you look at these two groups on a comprehension test, having a view to multitasking significantly decreases your comprehension for the exact same lecture. Think about yourself in your own office setting where you're trying to write up a report and your email icon is blinking. You are not answering that email, you're being very good, but part of your mind is already gone. You're thinking, what is that email? I'm not opening it, but is it a funny video? Is it a new job I have to do? Did they reassign my classroom? So even though you're actively inhibiting that response, part of you is already gone. So that is a cost to you. So I try to convince my students, this is something that all of us have to buy in together. And I tell them, this is a good example of self-regulation. Can you delay immediate gratification for some future reward later in time? This is something that psychologists have been very interested in. Self-regulation correlates very strongly with academic success. I tell my students that this is something that you can even test in a 6-year-old. So there's something called the marshmallow test. So the marshmallow test is when you offer a 4-year-old one marshmallow now, and you say, if you can wait 15 minutes, you'll get a second marshmallow. And being a good cognitive psychologist, I tested out my own daughter when she turned 4. And I jokingly tell my students that Monica was trained for 4 years for this test. That's what Asian parents do. Every time we went shopping, we bought groceries. I gave the cake or whatever we bought to Monica. We're in the car ride home. I gave it to her and I said, you can smell this. You can touch it. You cannot lick it. And after a while, this just became normal to delay that gratification. So it was with complete confidence that I gave her this marshmallow test. So that was the longest 15 minutes of Monica's life, right? Monica, do you still like marshmallows? Yeah. So I tell my students, if a 4-year-old can wait 15 minutes, surely you can wait at least 15 minutes. I mean, if you could wait half an hour, there's a lot of things you could get done in deep work in just half an hour, and then maybe you can stretch that out to even 1 hour at a time. I'm not saying don't do any of these fun things. At the end of that established work period, now's your time to do that break, and then you can engage in that. So this is really promoting single tasking and delayed reward gratification. Okay, my lab has been really interested in other sort of practical interventions that we could introduce during, say, a lecture or any extended learning period so that we can improve long-term results. One of the things that we know is that as you engage in any type of complex cognitive task, at some point, attention is going to waver. So this is what we call mind wandering. So as I said, at some point, you're going to probably think during this lecture about other things that you have to do. Your mind's going to start drifting, but we're trying to figure out some interventions that will minimize some of this unintentional mind wandering. One of the things that we know that's effective from research in retrieval practice, sometimes called the testing effect, is that introducing quiz questions in the middle of your lecture can improve overall attention. And one of the best ways to incorporate this is through collaborative quizzes. So I use what's called a two-stage process where I will have typically a multiple choice question up on the board. My class uses iClickers, but you don't have to do that. I do this for bonus points. So at first, I have students actually answer the questions individually. And in our bonus schedule, whatever answer they select, they get 1 bonus point. Then after they've committed themselves to a question, then they can get into groups and discuss with each other and debate, and now only the correct response gets an additional bonus point. So this two-stage process has been found to be most effective. And when we measure overall mind wandering in the classroom, we found that compared to not having quiz questions at all, introducing quiz questions reduced unintentional mind wandering in the lecture throughout the lecture from first half to second half. Interestingly enough, intentional mind wandering, so you're converting unintentional mind wandering to intentional mind wandering. We're still not sure exactly what that means, but some of that intentional mind wandering could be thinking about connections with course material, thinking about other types of examples. So getting rid of mind wandering completely is not necessarily the goal, but what we are trying to reduce is unintentional mind wandering. Why is this type of collaborative quizzing something that's good? So here's just a summary of some ideas that researchers have suggested why we are seeing this benefit. For the top students in your classroom, it reinforces their existing learning, and there's also sort of a communication skill piece here where they have to discuss and convince other people about what is the correct response. The weakest students in your class, they can realize their misconception. They can have it corrected by a peer who could explain things in their own language. And sometimes students find that having it explained by one of their peers is better than having it explained to them by a professor. And students in the middle of the classroom realize, okay, they are like most of the other students in this classroom. They have similar understandings. They can hear new examples or takes on explanations of the same material. Okay, another area of research that we've been interested in looking at is during this extended study period, so say a student is studying in a library for several hours at a time, or maybe some of you teach a night class where it's a 3-hour extended period. What's the best thing to do? Because staying in a complex cognitive task for a long time, inevitably your mind is going to wander. We were interested in seeing what type of breaks might be the best thing to introduce. And for a variety of reasons, we were most interested in strategic exercise breaks to introduce during extended study periods. Why? Well, exercise breaks increase arousal. And with increased arousal, you can focus your attention. And when you focus your attention on learning, it leads to a much better chance for actually incorporating this into your long-term memory. And so, in this study, we had students study 1 week's worth of introductory psychology course material. It was the most challenging topic that they would face. It was on the neuroscience of form perception, so this is routinely rated as the most difficult material in the course. So students were seeing this for the first time. In the no breaks control group, they had to just continuously study this 1 week's worth of course material. This is sometimes what students say that they do. I'm going to go to the library. I'm not going to even get up until I know everything inside out. The second group, we introduced 3 strategic 5-minute breaks to sort of break up this extended study period. During these 5-minute breaks, they got to play a computer game. And in the third group, they had the same 5-minute breaks, but they engaged in 5 minutes of high-intensity interval training exercise. So they were doing jumping jacks, burpees. Most of the students in this study were quite sedentary, so this was quite a shock to a lot of these students. We were then interested in looking at 2 things. How do these breaks impact their overall attention during study? And here's the first finding. So the no breaks group and the non-exercise breaks groups, they both show a decline in attention from the first half of study to the second half of study. This is what we typically see during a complex cognitive task. What was interesting for me here was that by taking these non-exercise breaks, there was no actual benefit here. So if the idea was that any type of break is good for you, we would expect to see some sort of return in attention levels. We compared this to the groups who had 5 minutes of high-intensity interval training. They maintained their attention from the first half to the second half of study. So all these groups are studying the same difficult course material, but one group, the exercise breaks groups, they're paying attention far more than the other 2 groups. We were interested in seeing, well, how does this translate into actual memory, actual performance on comprehension tests following the lecture? So we gave a test immediately, and then we also asked students to come back 2 days later to do a different test to see how well this information was retained. And here is the performance for the control and exercise breaks, a non-exercise breaks group. We see that they performed similarly. And the exciting finding was that the exercise breaks group significantly outperformed the other 2 groups. And this was a difference that was maintained 2 days later. So if any of you teach a night class, how many people here do teach a 3-hour night class? So typically, I think a lot of instructors on the very first day of night class, they ask their students a question. We all know we have 3 hours of material here. We can either have a couple of breaks, or I'll just push all the way through and I'll try to let you out as early as possible. When students are given this choice, most people will go with option 2 and say, let's just plow through because I want to get out here as soon as possible. What our research demonstrates is that that might be the least optimal choice, and that having scheduled breaks, in our case, what we're arguing is that exercise breaks is actually what's best. Why are exercise breaks best? That's a really good question. One of the things that we think is that when you do a break that switches from one cognitive task to another, like listening to a lecture to playing computer games, you're just switching from one cognitive task to another. Less complex, but it's not truly a break. What might be really remarkable about the exercise breaks is that it's a true break from this sustained attention that a student is expected to maintain. There's other research that shows that even just a walk in nature, some sort of even light exercise can improve working memory and focused attention during learning. It's an ongoing area of research that I'm interested in looking at, but those are some of the directions that we are investigating. Okay, so summarize this very first section. It's up to you as the instructor to really set the tone for focused attention. The very first day of class, I always make sure I start my class exactly on time so that students know that, yeah, you have to be punctual for this class. And I really set the tone and the culture for focused attention. And I try to get the entire class to buy in. I show them data. I show them the evidence of why I go forth with almost all the pedagogical decisions that I make. And another way that you could directly change the structure of your course is within your lectures, introducing quiz questions, getting people to think about the course material. This has been demonstrated not just by my lab, but by several others to reduce mind wandering, focus attention, and improve comprehension of the course material. Okay. The second point that I want to make is talking about how instructional design directly impacts student learning. And if there's one thing that you can change about your teaching, and there's so many things you can change, you'll hear about a lot of different things, is to make better PowerPoint presentations or whatever slideware that you use for your lectures. This is actually a very rich area of research called multimedia learning, and I'll talk to you about some of the research done by one of my former grad students, Dr. Barb Fennessy. And she's been really interested in looking at evidence-based practices that emerge from these lab studies that can directly impact overall academic performance. So a little bit about the theory behind what's going on. All of us here, we're sitting in this room where there is almost an infinite amount of sensory information that you can possibly process. And we're trying to get some of this sensory information into our long-term memory. The bottleneck here is something that's called working memory capacity. So there's only so much information that you can hold and draw from long-term memory and make connections. And that little bottleneck is called working memory capacity. So all of us have some level of working memory capacity. You can go online and do a test to see what your own working memory capacity is. What happens when you're given a slide like this? So this is a very common type of slide that's used in many teaching lectures. Why do people use slides like this? It's because they are really thinking about the slide from their own perspective. What would help me teach this lesson? If I gave you one piece of advice, you should always think, what on this slide will help this room understand the narrative that I'm trying to explain? And when you think about it from that perspective, you might put very different things on these slides compared to if you're thinking of this as just sort of narration notes for you to read. In a worst case scenario, I've really seen lecturers just stand up here and read these bullet points aloud. All these bullet points come up at once, and they read these bullet points aloud to the students. When you do that, this actually leads to a situation where a student is trying to listen to what the instructor is saying. They're trying to read, and that reading might be at a different speed from the narrator's voice. And this leads to a conflict called cognitive overload. They can't process these two things at the same time. And typically, what a person will do in this situation is give up. They will stop listening to the instructor, and if they see these bullet points, especially if these slides are not available, what are they going to do? They're going to write these bullet points down as quickly as possible, and they are not there to listen to you at all. This is fine if you are trying to train a group of court transcribers to get a verbatim transcript of what was said, dictated in that lecture. But if you ask a court transcriber, can you read back what the witness just said? They could give you a verbatim transcript of exactly what was said. But if you ask that court transcriber, what did you think about that testimony? Do you think it made sense with what they said earlier and what the other witness said? They'll have no idea, because their job is to dispassionately capture what was dictated in that courtroom. And in the same way, when you have slides like that, you're training a group of students to dispassionately capture what was spoken in that room without really any thought or connections to that material. So let's take a look at a lab study that demonstrates this. So here are two different slides. So in this type of study, we'll have learners who are exposed to different types of slides. They're listening to the exact same lecture. On the left, we have what's called the complementary. This is a slide with visuals that complement the main narration of what the instructor is trying to explain. And on the right, we have the same visuals, but we've added the verbatim transcript of what the lecturer is communicating. So this is probably better than a slide that just has bullet points of text, but we'll use this for comparison. When you give a comprehension test at the end of this lecture, what we see here is an 11% boost just by having slides that visually complement what the speaker is saying instead of a verbatim transcript. Now, in a lab, 11%, that's a pretty big effect. If this held in the real world, in an actual classroom, you could improve your students' performance by 11%. That would be a big deal. That's several grade points. You're giving the exact same lectures, but you're just changing your slides. Now, why might this actually come about? So I told you a bit about cognitive overload, where a person's listening to the lecturer, they are trying to read, they're going back and forth. We can capture this experience by using a technology called eye tracking. So these are just things that we put on to a learner, and we can track exactly where they're looking at on a slide. So I'm going to show you a video that, that demonstrates exactly where a student is looking at a PowerPoint slide. And I'll show you 2 videos. I told you about working memory capacity, so each of us in this room, I could give you a working memory capacity test. I could do a median split. I could say, oh, let's compare how people with lower working memory capacity perform with students who have higher working memory capacity. So here is a student who scores high on working memory capacity. Here, if you follow the green dot, this is where they're focusing their visual attention. You're not hearing the audio, but there's an audio narration that's also playing. And I'm going to compare this to another student who has a lower working memory capacity. They're listening to the exact same lecture, watching the exact same slide, but see if you could spot differences in the patterns of visual attention. Okay, could anyone kind of describe what might be going on here? Yeah?
So I think about early working hours, you really can take much of the text and the lecture.
Yeah.
Low working hours, she can move on with the
The back and forth part is actually really important. So over here in the bottom screen, the lower working memory capacity, you can see that there's kind of lines across the screen. So in real time, you would see that the person's actually doing what's called recursions. They're going back and forth, back and forth. In a way, they're kind of desperately trying to match their reading speed with the narrator's narration. This leads to a lot of confusion. At one point, they're going to try to give up, but they're spending a lot of their resources just trying to understand what's going on. When we do this type of split and analysis, and then we think, how does working memory capacity predict performance? There's a strong positive correlation here. So now, when you have poorly designed slides, working memory capacity is an important factor for determining how well you're going to understand this lecture. When you have well-designed slides, the eye tracking patterns look very similar, and now working memory capacity is no longer a predictor of comprehension score on this. So good PowerPoint and presentation slide design is best for everyone, but it especially helps those with lower working memory capacity. So as instructors, this is what I really try to encourage you to do. Think very thoughtfully about every single slide that you have up there. What should be on that slide that will help your audience to understand the message that you're trying to communicate? Now, these are very controlled lab studies that we perform, and then sometimes I hear instructors say, well, that's fine in a lab, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate into a real actual classroom. So let me show you some research conducted by my colleague Catherine Overson at the University of New Hampshire. So she works at a teaching and learning center, and she asked for instructors to volunteer. So people who've been teaching the same course for several years, they're very familiar with the course material, and she said, okay, just give me your lectures. So if there were, say, 30 lectures that they were giving, they randomly selected half these lectures. And she took these lectures and she improved the slide design according to established multimedia learning principles. She is not a subject matter expert in these dozens of different subject matters areas. So she gave back the slides to the instructors and said, just check over these slides and make sure everything is still accurate. And then go about and do your regular teaching. On some lectures, they use their old slides. And on some lectures, they use the new and improved slides. Anecdotally, she said that most of these instructors were very skeptical that this will make any difference at all. But to have some objective measures, they had a quiz at the end of every lecture so they could compare performance on the old slides versus the slides that conform to multimedia learning principles. And then they also looked at long-term learning by looking at the performance on the midterm and final exam, comparing concepts taught in these two different types of lectures. So I'll just show you an example. Here is a typical slide, the most common type of slide that she tried to make some adjustments to. instead of having just bullet points of text, as often as she could, she tried to introduce organization and visuals that complement what the speaker is saying. This does not mean you always have to have a picture. So how she reorganized this information was to simply make it into a table. And now you could kind of see the overall organization, the relationships between terms. So this is the exact same information, but presented in a way that will better communicate that information with the audience. Here's another example. So these are actual slides that instructors gave her. You can see that there's a lot of irrelevant visuals here that have nothing to do with the actual lecture. So in this case, just to simplify it, rather than having, say, a wall of text come up at once, she kept one of these visuals, she got rid of irrelevant information, and then she just had these points come up one at a time. So that's a very simple thing. If you're going to have text, at least have the text come up point by point as discussion, instead of having a wall of text up at once, because when you do, students are just going to be reading the text and trying to copy down as quickly as possible and not listen to the actual instructor. Now, she looked at immediate learning by comparing performance on quizzes, and across a dozen different courses with different subject matter areas, she saw about a 10% boost in performance. Now, what impresses me here is that this is a real classroom where there's a lot of noise. There's many different variables outside of the control. The only thing being switched here are the slide design. Students could do things like extra studying to completely negate the response. But across these dozen different instructors, she saw about a 10% immediate gain in performance. And when you look at the final exam, she also saw about a 10 to 12% overall improvement in the long term for concepts that were originally taught with the original slides versus the slides that conform to multimedia learning principles. So this is a very rich area of research in psychology, and in the lab we see medium to large effect sizes. So this is something that we're very confident about, and this is something that really actually translates into the classroom. So it's one of the areas of research that have been really beautifully studied in intervention studies in the classroom, demonstrating that these robust effects are maintained in the real classroom. If you happen to be interested in this area, I could recommend a book by Richard Mayer. He is one of the leaders in this field on multimedia learning. Okay, the final point that I want to make is that as instructors, we really have an opportunity to model good studying behaviors. So as a faculty member, you probably were one of the best students in your class. So you have a lot of things that you can add to the student experience. So if we know that highlighting and passively rereading notes or textbook is not a good thing, what are things that actually work? So one of the things that across several different studies have been demonstrated is elaborative interrogation and self-explanation. So for that student that comes in and says that they really understand what independent variable is, if they can actually explain what an independent variable is with their own words, if they could come up with novel examples that aren't provided for them in the textbook or in my lecture, if they can explain this to one of their colleagues, it really demonstrates some mastery. So I try to encourage this type of behavior as much as possible in my classroom. One of the creative ways that I came upon, starting a few years ago for the midterm test, I started a meme contest. So this was a contest where they had to create a meme that illustrates one of the concepts that will be tested on in the upcoming midterm, and whichever meme, a student-created meme, gets the most likes, I deliver pizza to their tutorial. They think that this is really fun, and it becomes a really ferocious competition. And I'll just show you some of my favorites. So there's a concept in psychology that students learn called functional fixedness. That's if I show you a coffee mug, and the only thing you could think of this being used for is a vehicle for drinking liquids. But it could be a hat, it could be a walnut crusher. There's lots of different things you could think of. So this is Liam Neeson from Taken. And he says, I don't know what functional fixedness is, but I will find you and use all the tools at my disposal in their intended ways. Here's another one about action potentials. Why was a neuron scared of of exceeding -50? He didn't want to get fired. What do we say that second marshmallow? Not today. All right, so those are examples of some kind of creative, fun assignments that I introduced to the classroom. Students really like these things. It really feels like they're part of a community. Another one that I'm sure that many of you already heard about is called practice testing. So if the very first time that you practice retrieving information is on the day of the test, well then the very first time you're practicing retrieving that information is the day of the test, and that is a problem. So a very vast literature demonstrates that the best way to study is to practice retrieving that information before the actual test. So that could be as simple as covering up information, seeing how well you understand it. Obviously, being as actively involved as possible is a good thing. Flashcards are another way that students could engage in retrieval practice. However, it could quickly turn into a passive form if a student is reading a definition, a term, flipping over, and just reading the definition and telling themselves, yeah, I know that, or I'll know that on the test. Students have to make a choice to be actively involved. And an instructor gave me a really great idea to encourage students to engage in active use of flashcards. So you can have one set of flashcards with all the terms that they have to know. You could have a second set of flashcards with instructions like, think of an example from your own life where this concept pertains, or take two flashcards and try to build a connection between these two, or think of a movie that illustrated this concept, things like that. So they have to take one flashcard from each pile and then do what it says. So this kind of forces them to engage with the flashcards actively. Now, in my own course design, I think typical post-secondary education courses have infrequent high-stakes testing for various reasons. One way that I kind of built this right into my course of having frequent low-stakes testing is to replace that format by having weekly testing. So in my course, because it's such a large course, all of the questions are multiple choice, but as Amy's son will tell you, I have a reputation as being a very tough tester because I don't have questions that are just recall recognition. About a third of the questions are basic recall recognition, but 2/3 of the question are, here's a brand new situation that you've not seen before and you cannot Google. Do you really understand what this concept is? These are all online tests, and I'm completely upfront with students at the beginning of the year and saying, yeah, I guess this is like an assignment. You could get together in groups, and you could do this together, but as consistent with everything I told you, you should be an active participant in these quizzes. So 1 year on the final exam, I gave them a bonus question to try to see what their behaviors were. So the question was, you may have chosen to write the weekly quizzes in groups. Which of the following best describes your involvement in that group? One option was I wrote most of the quizzes on my own, and about half the students in the course said that they wrote most of the quizzes on their own for various reasons. It's hard to coordinate with people. I just want to do them on my own. Second option was I actively listened and absorbed the discussion. Third, I actively listened to the discussion and occasionally provided inputs. I frequently contributed to the discussion, or I led the discussion for most of the questions. So D and E, they're kind of the leaders in the group. A, people who did them independently. And if you read B very carefully, it's a very polite way of saying you did nothing. You just listened to what people said was the right answer, and that's what you wrote down. So I use this to categorize students, and I want to see how did this affect their actual academic performance. So here are the results from their weekly quizzes. So here are students who self-reported writing most of the quizzes on their own. When you write quizzes in a group, not surprisingly, like collaborative testing, yeah, you do better. Overall quiz performance was better, but interestingly, if you made more active contributions to the group discussion, you did better on these weekly quizzes. This might be a result of working in different groups. I was really interested now, how does this translate into performance on the final exam when you are on your own and you have no other resources in front of you? So your true mastery of these concepts. If you wrote the quizzes on your own, they were a very good predictor of how you performed on the final exam. They were the exact same types of questions, same type of breakdown. If you were the frequent contributor leader, not surprisingly, you did better on the final exam. But the real question was, what happened to these people who were the social loafers, who were just kind of passively listening? They did very poorly in the final exam. So this was a wake-up call for them. So this is a graph I showed the students at the beginning of the year and said, yeah, you could do whatever you want. This is what the data shows how you are likely to perform on the final exam, which is worth the biggest component of your final grade. So practice testing, a wealth of literature that shows, yeah, it's a really good thing. It actively engages students. There's also something called distributed practice, which you're probably already somewhat familiar with. If you have a test on one day and you spread out your study time very efficiently across several days leading up, that's distributing your practice. Unfortunately, for most students, what they end up doing is taking that same amount of studying time and cramming it all to the night before. So what I try to convince students is I'm not even trying to get them to study more. I'm just trying to get them to spread out their studying. And there's many different studies that demonstrate why this is better. So here's a study done by Cornell involving motivated students who are studying vocabulary words for the GRE exam. And in one condition, they had students studying 8 times in one day right before they wrote the test. And another group, they were studying the same total number of hours, but spread out over 4 days. So this is a really good comparison. Same total time on task, but it's either crammed or it's spaced out over 4 days. And when you do that, there's a significant increase in performance for the same total time on study. So this is the effects of distributed practice. Now, if we can take the testing effect and connect that with distributed practice, we have something that's called successive relearning. And this is the most exciting tip that I give to students. So in a successive relearning task, you have students, in this case, imagine you get people to use flashcards. They come into a supervised condition where they have to learn the flashcards to a specific criterion. Like say they have to get them each correct 2 times and demonstrate mastery. Then they leave. They come back the next day and they relearn the same material. Then they leave. They come back the next day and relearn the same material. And they come back one more time. So they have one initial learning session and then they have to return on 3 occasions. So this is called successive relearning. It's practice testing and it's got built-in distributed practice. So here is a case study by Rawson and colleagues in 2013. This is a real introductory psychology class where they selected 64 concepts that were going to be on the final exam. So students who were in this study came into a lab, they randomly selected half of these terms, and they were assigned to this flashcard successive relearning study. And they had one initial learning session where they had to demonstrate mastery going through the flashcards, true mastery and not just passively learning. Then they left. It took about half an hour or 45 minutes the very first time. They came back the next day. They did it again. This time it took them maybe half an hour. They left. They came back again. Maybe it took them 20 minutes. They left and they come back again. Maybe it took them about 10 to 15 minutes. So about a 2-hour commitment learning these 32 concepts. Now, you could look at performance on the final exam when all sorts of other studying and stuff has taken place in between. How do students perform on these 32 concepts where they were forced to engage in successive relearning compared to these 32 control concepts? So here are the results. On the final exam, there was a 12% difference. So remember, this is just a single 2-hour commitment across 4 days in the term. And there's a 12% improvement in performance just from this single intervention. Now, I said at the beginning, I'm really interested in durable learning. So they did something interesting. They brought students back 3 days and 24 days later after the final exam. Now, let's look at 3 days later. The control concepts dropped to 27%. meaning they understood it for the final exam, but it was gone. But look at the successive relearning concept. They dropped from 84 to 80%. That's pretty good retention 3 days after the final exam. So they also brought the students back 24 days later when I'm pretty sure no additional studying has taken place since that final exam. And now you see that the control concepts dropped to 17%, but the successive relearning concepts remain sticky. They're still at about 64%, almost a month later. So this is a pretty impressive finding to me. So it was so impressive that I actually created flashcards as a PDF, and I distributed to students and said, here's the study, here's what you have to do. If you do successive relearning with these concepts, I am pretty confident that you're going to do well on the final exam. Okay. So one last question I want to leave you with is, what are the habits that lead to a healthy lifestyle? Does anyone have any suggestions? Exercise. What else? Sleep. What else? Eat healthy, low sugar. Okay, so these are things you're pretty confident about. Why don't you do them? So students are the same way. Like, even when I show them the data, they're like, yeah, that's a good idea. I really should do that. What I find is that they need the next step. They need to be coached. So I tell them about successive relearning. I tell them about distributed practice. Then I take 5 minutes before our midterm and say, everyone get your calendar, either your actual calendar or your computer out right now. And I want you to look at, on this Friday, you have a big test in this course. I want you to estimate how much time you can actually devote to this test. And most students say, well, I'm just going to keep studying until I know everything. I said, well, this is just one course. I think you have 4 other courses. Maybe you have a part-time job. Maybe you have family obligations. I want you to realistically come up with a number, looking at your calendar, how many hours you can spend. Maybe it's 3 hours. Maybe it's 10 hours. But whatever, I want you to commit yourself to a number. Now, divide this by 3 into 3 or 4 space study sessions and put it into your calendar right now. Make an appointment with yourself in your calendar of when you're going to do these space study sessions. This will encourage you not to do the mass studying the night before where other things fall through the cracks. Now, you can do this for your other tests as well. And many students come up to me and say, you know what? It made sense what you're saying, but if we didn't do that activity in class right then, I probably would not have done that. Okay, so in conclusion, 3 things I talked about. Learning begins with effortful and focused attention. This is something that you set the tone for. Instructional design is key. Perhaps the biggest single change that you can make personally that you have complete control over is better designed presentations for your students to understand. And finally, we all have an opportunity to model and incorporate effective study habits and ways of learning directly into your course structure. And if we turn back to Monica, what I ultimately want at the end of the day is a creative student who really just loves the course material. So when Monica said, let's take everything out of the fridge and I'll go inside, and I said, well, I don't think we can do that. Can you think of another idea of what we can do? And she sat there for a moment, and then she took my phone and said, let's make a movie. I'll put this inside the fridge, and then we'll see what actually happens. And so that's exactly what she did. So here she is explaining the experiment. That's my iPhone in the fridge, and the lights actually go out. So there you go, confirmed proof. Thank you very much.